That Nils Holgersson travelled with the wild geese, there was a woman who thought of writing a book about Sweden, which would be suitable for children to read in the schools. She had thought of this from Christmas time until the following autumn, but not a line of the book had she written. At last she became so tired of the whole thing that she said to herself: "You are not fitted for such work. Sit down and compose stories and legends as usual, and let another write this book, which has got to be serious and instructive, and in which there must not be one untruthful word." It was as good as settled that she would abandon the idea. But she thought very naturally it would have been agreeable to write something beautiful about Sweden, and it was hard for her to relinquish her work. Finally it occurred to her that maybe it was because she lived in a city with only gray streets and house walls around her, that she could make no headway with the writing. Perhaps if she were to go into the country, where she could see woods and fields, that it might go better. She was from Vermland, and it was perfectly clear to her that she wished to begin the book with that province. First of all she would write about the place where she had grown up. It was a little homestead far removed from the great world, where many old time habits and customs were retained. She thought that it would be entertaining for children to hear of the manifold duties which had succeeded one another the year around. She wanted to tell them how they celebrated Christmas and New Year and Easter and Midsummer Day in her home, what kind of house furnishings they had, what the kitchen and larder were like, and how the cow shed, stable, lodge, and bath house had looked. But when she was to write about it, the pen would not move. Why this was, she could not in the least understand. Nevertheless, it was so. True, she remembered it all just as distinctly as if she were still living in the midst of it. She argued with herself that since she was going into the country anyway, perhaps she ought to make a little trip to the old homestead that she might see it again, before writing about it. She had not been there in many years, and did not think it half bad to have a reason for the journey. In fact, she had always longed to be there, no matter in what part of the world she happened to be. She had seen many places that were more pretentious and prettier, but nowhere could she find such comfort and protection as in the home of her childhood. It was not such an easy matter for her to go home as one might think, for the estate had been sold to people she did not know. She felt to be sure that they would receive her well, but she did not care to go to the old place to sit and talk with strangers, for she wanted to recall how it had been in times gone by. That was why she planned it so as to arrive there late in the evening, when the day's work was done and the people were indoors. She had never imagined that it would be so wonderful to come home. As she sat in the cart and drove toward the old homestead, she fancied that she was growing younger and younger every minute, and that soon she would no longer be an oldish person with hair that was turning gray, but a little girl in short skirts with a long flaxen braid. As she recognized each farm along the road, she could not picture anything else than that everything at home would be as in bygone days. Her father and mother and brothers and sisters would be standing on the porch to welcome her. The old housekeeper would run to the kitchen window to see who was coming, and Nero and Freja and another dog or two would come bounding and jumping up on her. The nearer she approached the place, the happier she felt. It was autumn, which meant a busy time with a round of duties. It must have been all these varying duties which prevented home from ever being monotonous. All along the way the farmers were digging potatoes, and probably they would be doing likewise at her home. That meant that they must begin immediately to grate potatoes and make potato flour. The autumn had been a mild one. She wondered if everything in the garden had already been stored. The cabbages were still out, but perhaps the hops had been picked and all the apples. It would be well if they were not having house cleaning at home. Autumn fair time was drawing nigh. Everywhere the cleaning and scouring had to be done before the fair opened. That was regarded as a great event, more especially by the servants. It was a pleasure to go into the kitchen on market eve and see the newly scoured floor strewn with juniper twigs, the whitewashed walls, and the shining copper utensils which were suspended from the ceiling. Even after the fair festivities were over, there would not be much of a breathing spell, for then came the work on the flax. During dog days the flax had been spread out on a meadow to mould. Now it was laid in the old bath house, where the stove was lighted to dry it out. When it was dry enough to handle, all the women in the neighbourhood were called together. They sat outside the bath house and picked the flax to pieces. Then they beat it with swingles to separate the fine white fibres from the dry stems. As they worked, the women grew gray with dust. Their hair and clothing were covered with flaxseed, but they did not seem to mind it. All day the swingles pounded, and the chatter went on, so that when one went near the old bath house, it sounded as if a blustering storm had broken loose there. After the work with the flax came the big hardtack baking, the sheep shearing, and the servants' moving time. In November there were busy slaughter days, with salting of meats, sausage making, baking of blood pudding, and candle steeping. The seamstresses who used to make up their homespun dresses had to come at this time, of course, and those were always two pleasant weeks, when the women folk sat together and busied themselves with sewing. The cobbler, who made shoes for the entire household, sat working at the same time in the manservants' quarters, and one never tired of watching him as he cut the leather and soled and heeled the shoes, and put eyelets in the shoestring holes. But the greatest rush came around Christmas time. Lucia Day, when the housemaid went about dressed in white with candles in her hair, and served coffee to everybody at 5 in the morning, came as a sort of reminder that for the next 2 weeks they could not count on much sleep. For now they must brew the Christmas ale, steep the Christmas fish in lye, and do their Christmas baking and Christmas scouring. She was in the middle of the baking, with pans of Christmas buns and cooky platters all around her, when the driver drew in the reins at the end of the lane, as she had requested. She started like one suddenly awakened from a sound sleep. It was dismal for her, who had just dreamed herself surrounded by all her people, to be sitting alone in the late evening. As she stepped from the wagon and started to walk up the long lane that she might come unobserved to her old home, she felt so keenly the contrast between then and now, that she would have preferred to turn back. "Of what use is it to come here?" she sighed. "It can't be the same as in the old days." On the other hand, she felt that since she had travelled such a long distance, she would see the place at all events, so continued to walk on, although she was more depressed with every step that she took. She had heard that it was very much changed, and it certainly was. But she did not observe this now in the evening. She thought rather that everything was quite the same. There was the pond, which in her youth had been full of carp, and where no one dared fish, because it was father's wish that the carp should be left in peace. Over there were the men servants' quarters, the larder and barn, with the farmyard bell over one gable and the weather vane over the other. The house yard was like a circular room, with no outlook in any direction, as it had been in her father's time, for he had not the heart to cut down as much as a bush. She lingered in the shadow under the big mountain ash at the entrance to the farm, and stood looking about her. As she stood there, a strange thing happened. A flock of doves came and lit beside her. She could hardly believe that they were real birds, for doves are not in the